Greetings, Danny fans. Welcome back to the mighty Danny, the champion of the world. I haven't read for a couple of weeks, so we're going to catch up, starting from chapter 16. And let's see how far we can get. Chapter 16, the champion of the world. It was not as dark as I had expected it to be inside the woods at this time. Little glints and glimmers from the brilliant moon outside shone through the leaves and gave the place a cold, eerie look. I brought a light for each of us, my father said. We're going to need it later. He handed me one of these small pocket torches shaped like a fountain pen. I switched mine on. It threw a long, narrow beam of surprising brightness, and when I moved it around, it was like waving a very long white wand among the trees. I switched it off. We started walking back towards the clearing where the pheasants had eaten the raisins. This, my father said, will be the first time in the history of the world that anyone has even tried to poach roosting pheasants. Isn't it marvellous, though, to be able to walk around without worrying about keepers? You don't think Mr. Rabbit might have sneaked back again just to make sure? Never, my father said. He's gone home to his supper. I couldn't help thinking that if I had been Mr. Rabbit, and if I had seen two suspicious-looking characters lurking outside my precious pheasant wood, I certainly would not have gone home for my supper. My father must have sensed my fears, because once again he reached out and took my hand in his, folding his long, warm fingers around mine. Hand in hand, we threaded our way through the trees towards the clearing. In a few minutes, we were there. Here's where we threw the raisins, my father said. I peered through the bushes. The clearing lay pale and milky in the moonlight. What do we do next? I asked. We stay here and wait, my father said. I could just make out his face under the peak of his cap, the lips pale, the cheeks flushed, the eyes shining bright. Are they all roosting, Dad? Yes, they're all around us. They don't go far. Could I see them if I shone my light up into the branches? No, he said. They're up pretty high and they hide amongst the leaves. We stood, waiting for something to happen. But nothing happened. It was very quiet there in the wood. Danny, my father said. Yes, Dad? I've been wondering how a bird managed to keep its balance sitting on a branch when it's asleep. I don't know, I said. Why? It's very peculiar, he said. What's peculiar? It's peculiar that a bird doesn't topple off its perch as soon as it goes to sleep. After all, if we were sitting up on a branch and we went to sleep, we would fall off at once, wouldn't we? Birds have claws and long toes, Dad. I expect they hold on with those. I know that, Danny, but I still don't understand why the toes keep gripping the perch once the bird is asleep. Surely everything goes limp when you fall asleep. I waited for him to go on. I was just thinking, he said, that if a bird can keep its balance when it's asleep, then surely there isn't any reason why the pills should make it fall down. It's doped, I said. Surely it will fall down if it's doped. But isn't that simply a deeper sort of sleep, he said. Why should we expect it to fall down just because it's in a deeper sleep? There was a gloomy silence. I should have tested with roosters, my father said. Suddenly the blood seemed to have drained right out of his cheeks. His face was so pale I thought he might go faint. My dad would have tested it with roosters before he did anything else, he said. At that moment there came a soft thump from the wood behind us. What was that? I asked. Shh! He stood up listening. Thump. There's another, I said. It was a deep muffled sound as though a bag of sand had been dropped onto the ground. Thump. They're pheasants, I cried. Wait. They must be pheasants, Dad. Thump, thump. You may be right, Danny. We switched on our torches and ran towards the sounds. Where were they? My father said. Over there, Dad. 2 of them. Over there. I thought they were this way. Keep looking. It can't be far. We searched for about a minute. Here's one, my father called. When I got to him, he was holding a magnificent bird in both hands. He examined it closely with our torches. It's doped to high heaven, my father said. It won't wake up for a week. Thump. There's another, I cried. Thump, thump. 2 more, my father yelled. Thump, 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 thump. Jeepers, my father said. Thump, 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 thump. All around us, the pheasants were starting to rain down out of the trees. We began rushing round madly in the dark, sweeping the ground with our torches. Thump, thump, thump. This lot fell almost on top of me. I was right under the tree as they came down, and I found all three of them immediately. They were limp and warm, the feathers wonderfully soft in the hand. Where shall I put them, Dad? I called out. Lay them here, Danny. Just pile them up here where it's light. My father was standing on the edge of the clearing, with the moonlight streaming down all over him and a great bunch of pheasants in his hands. His face was bright, his eyes big and bright and wonderful. And he was staring around him like a child who just discovered that the whole world is made of chocolate. Thump, thump, thump. It's too many, I said. It's beautiful, he cried. He dumped the birds he was carrying and ran off to look for some more. Thump, 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 thump. It was easy to find them now. There were one or two lying under every tree. I quickly collected 6 more, 3 in each hand, and ran back and dumped them with the others. Then 6 more, then 6 more after that. And still they kept falling. My father was in a whirl of excitement now, dashing about like a mad ghost under the trees. I could see the beam of his torch waving around in the dark, and every time he found a bird, he gave a little yelp of triumph. Thump, thump, thump. Hey, Danny shouted. Yes, I'm over here. What is it, Dad? What do you think the great Mr. Victor Hazel would say if he could see this? I don't talk about it, I said. For 3 minutes or 4 minutes, the pheasants kept on falling. Then suddenly, they stopped. Keep searching, my father shouted. There's plenty more on the ground. Dad, I said, don't you think we ought to get out of here while the going's good? Never, he shouted, not on your life. We went on searching. Between us, we looked under every tree within 100 yards of the clearing, north, south, east, and west, and I think we found most of them in the end. At the collecting point, there was a pile of pheasants as big as a bonfire. It's a miracle, my father was saying. It's an absolute miracle. He was staring at them in a kind of trance. Shouldn't we just take about 6 each and get out of here, I said. I wouldn't like to count them, Danny. Dad, not now. I must count them. Can't we do that later? 1, 2, 3, 4. He began counting them carefully, picking up each bird in turn and laying it carefully to one side. The moon was directly overhead now, and the whole clearing was brilliantly lit up. I felt as though I was standing in the glare of powerful headlamps. 117, 118, 119, 120, he cried. It's an all-time record. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him in his life before. The most my dad ever got was 15. This, my dear boy, is an all-time world record. I expect it is, I said, and you did it, Danny. The whole thing was your idea in the first place. I didn't do it, Dad. Oh, yes, you did. And you know what? That makes you, my dear boy, it makes you the champion of the world. He pulled up his sweater and unwound the 2 big cotton sacks from around his belly. Here's yours, he said, handing one of them to me. Fill it up quick. The light of the moon was so strong I could read the print across the front of the sack. It said, J.W. Crump, Keston Flour Mills, London, SW17. You don't think that keeper with the brown teeth is watching us at this very moment from behind a tree? I said. No chance, my father said. If he's anywhere, he'll be down the filling station, waiting to catch us coming home with the loot. We started loading the pheasants into the sacks. They were soft and floppy, and the skin underneath the feathers was still warm. We can't possibly carry this lot all the way home, I said. Of course not. There'll be a taxi waiting for us at the track outside the wood. A taxi, I said. My dad always made use of a taxi on a big job, he said. Why a taxi, for heaven's sake? Ah, it's more secret, Danny. Nobody knows who's inside a taxi, except the driver. Which driver? I asked. Which driver? Ah, Charlie Kinch. He's only too glad to oblige. Does he know about poaching too? Oh, Charlie Kinch? Of course he does. He's poached more pheasants in his time than we've sold gallons of petrol. We finished loading the sacks, and my father humped his onto his shoulders. I couldn't do that with mine. It was too heavy for me. Drag it, my father said. Just drag it along the ground. My sack with 60 birds inside, and it weighed a ton, but it slid quite easily over the dry leaves with me walking backwards and pulling it with both hands. We came to the edge of the wood and peered through the hedge onto the track. My father said, Charlie boy, very softly, and the old man behind the wheel of the taxi poked his head out into the moonlight and gave us a sly, toothless grin. We slid through the hedge, dragging the sacks after us along the ground. Hello, 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 Charlie Kinch said. What's all this then? Chapter 17, The Taxi. 2 minutes later, we were safely inside the taxi and cruising slowly down the bumpy track towards the road. My father was bursting with pride and excitement. He kept leaning forward and tapping Charlie Kinch on the shoulder and saying, "How about it, Charlie? How about this for a haul?" And Charlie kept glancing back, pop-eyed at the huge bulging sacks. "Cripes, man," he said. "How did you do it?" "Danny did it," my father said proudly. "My son, Danny, is the champion of the world." Then Charlie said, "I reckons pheasants is going to be a bit scarce up in Mr. Vic Hazel's opening day shoot tomorrow, eh, Willem?" "I imagine they are, Charlie," my father said. "I imagine they are." "All those fancy folk," old Charlie said, "driving in from miles around with the big shiny cars, and there won't be one bird anywhere for them to shoot." Charlie Kinch started chuckling and chortling so much he nearly drove off the track. "Dad," I said, "what on earth are we going to do with all these pheasants?" "Share them out among our friends," my father said. "There's a dozen of them for Charlie here to start with." "All right, Charlie, that suits me," Charlie said. "Then there'll be a dozen for Doc Spencer and another dozen for Enoch Samways." "You mean Sergeant Samways?" I gasped. "Of course," my father said. "Enoch Samways is one of my very oldest friends." "Enoch's a good boy," Charlie Kinch said. "He's a lovely lad." Sergeant Enoch Samways, as I knew him very well, was the village policeman. He was a huge, plump man with a bristly black moustache, and he strode up and down our high street with the proud and measured tread of a man who knows he's in charge. The silver buttons on his uniform sparkled like diamonds, and the mere sight of him frightened me so much I used to cross over to the other side of the street whenever he approached. And there he is. "Enoch Samways likes a piece of roasted pheasant as much as the next man," my father said. "I reckon he knows a thing or two about catching them as well," Charlie Kinch said. I was astonished, but I was also rather pleased, because now I knew that great Sergeant Samways was human like the rest of us. Perhaps I wouldn't be so scared of him in the future. "Are you going to share them out tonight?" Dad asked. "Not tonight, Danny, no. You must always walk home empty-handed after a poaching trip. You can never be sure Mr. Rabbit's or one of his gang isn't waiting for you by the front door to see if you're carrying anything." "Ah, but he's a crafty one, that Mr. Rabbit's is," Charlie Kinch said. "The best thing is to pour a pound of sugar in the petrol tank of his car when he ain't looking. Then he can't ever come snooping around your house later on." We always made sure to give the keepers a little sugar in their tanks before we went out on a poach. "I'm surprised you didn't bother to do that, Willem, especially on a big job like this one." "What does sugar do?" I asked. "Blimey, it gums up the whole works," Charlie Kinch said. "You've got to take the entire engine to pieces before it will go again." "Ain't that right, Willem?" "That's right, Charlie," my father said. We came off the bumpy track onto the main road, and Charlie Kinch got the old taxi into top gear and headed for the village. "Are you dumping these birds at Mrs. Clipstone's place tonight?" he asked. "Yes," my father told him. "Drive straight to Mrs. Clipstone's." "Why Mrs. Clipstone's?" I asked. "What's she got to do with it?" "Mrs. Clipstone delivers everyone's pheasants," my father said. "Haven't I told you that?" "No, Dad, you haven't," I said, aghast. I was now more stunned than ever. Mrs. Grace Clipstone was the wife of Reverend Lionel Clipstone, the local vicar. "Always choose a respectable woman to deliver your pheasants," my father announced. "That's correct, Charlie, isn't it?" "Mrs. Clipstone's a right smart lady," Charlie said. I could hardly believe what they were saying. It was beginning to look as though just about everyone in the entire district was in on the poaching lark. "The vicar is very fond of roasted pheasant for his dinner," my father said. "Who isn't?" Charlie Kinch said, and he started chuckling to himself all over again. We were driving through the village now, and the street lamps were lit, and the men were wandering home from the meetings. I saw Mr. Snoddy, my headmaster, walking all the way home. "You know something, Danny," my father said. We've done these birds a great kindness, putting them to sleep in this nice, painless way. They would have had a very nasty time tomorrow if we hadn't got them first." "Rotten shots, most of those fellows are," Charlie Kinch said. "At least half the birds finish up winged and wounded." The taxi turned left and swung in through the gates of the vicarage. There were no lights in the house, and nobody met us. My father and I got out and dumped the pheasants in the coal shed at the rear. Then we said goodbye to Charlie Kinch and began to walk the 2 miles back to the filling station. Chapter 18. Home. Soon we had left the village behind us and were in open country. There was no one else in sight, just the two of us, my father and I, tired but happy, striding out along the curvy country road in the light of the moon. I can't believe it, my father kept saying. I simply cannot believe we pulled it off. My heart is still thumping, I said. So is mine, but oh, Danny, he cried, laying a hand on my shoulder, didn't we have a glorious time? We were walking right in the middle of the road, as though it was a private driveway running through our country estate, and we were the lords of all we surveyed. Do you realise, Danny, my father said, that on this very night, on this Friday the 13th of September, you and I have actually bagged 120 prime pheasants from Mr. Victor Hazelwood. I looked up at my father. His face was alight with happiness and his arms were waving all over the place as he went prancing along the middle of the road with his funny iron foot going clink, clink, clink. Roasted pheasant, he cried out, addressing the moon and the entire countryside. The finest and the most succulent dish on earth. I don't suppose you've ever eaten roasted pheasants, have you, Danny? Never, I said. You wait, he cried. You just wait till you taste it. It's an unbelievable flavour. It's sheer magic. Does it have to be roasted, Dad? Of course it has to be roasted. You don't ever boil a young bird. Why do you ask that? I was wondering how we would do the roasting. Don't you have to have an oven? Of course, he said, but we don't have an oven, Dad. All we've got is a paraffin burner. I know, he said, and that is why I've decided to buy an oven. Buy one, I cried. Yes, Danny, he said. With such a great and glorious stock of pheasants on our hands, it is important that we have the proper equipment. Therefore, we should go back into the village tomorrow morning and we shall buy an electric oven. We can get one at Wheeler's and we'll put it in the workshop. We've got plenty of electric plugs in the workshop. Won't it be very expensive? No expense is too great for roasted pheasant, my father announced superbly. And don't forget, Danny, before we put the bird in the oven, we have to lay strips of loveliness across it to keep it juicy, and bread sauce as well. We shall have to make bread sauce. You must never have roasted pheasant without lashings of bread sauce. There are 3 things you must always have with roasted pheasant: bread sauce, chipped potatoes, and boiled parsnips. There was half a minute's silence as we both allowed ourselves the pleasure of dreaming about these beautiful foods. And I'll tell you what else you've got to get, my father said. We've got to get one of those deep freezers where you can store things for months and months and they never go rotten. Dad, I said, no. But don't you realise, Danny, that even after we've given all the birds away to our friends, to Charlie Kinch and Reverend Clipstone and Doc Spencer and Enoch Samways and all the rest of them, there'll still be about 50 left for us. That is why we're going to need a deep freeze. But it will cost the earth, and worth every penny of it, he cried. Just imagine, Danny, my boy, any time we fancy a nice roasted pheasant for our supper, we'll just open up the lid of the freezer and help ourselves. Kings and queens don't live any better than that. At that moment, a barn owl flew across the road in front of us, its great white wings waving slowly in the moonlight. Did your mum have an oven in the kitchen, Dad? I asked, when you were a boy. She had something better than an oven, he said. It was called a cooker. It was a great, big, long, black thing, and we used to stoke it up with coal and keep it going for 24 hours a day, and it never went out. And if we didn't have any coal, we used bits of wood. Could you roast pheasants in it? You could roast anything in it, Danny. It was a lovely thing, that old cooker. It was used to keep the whole house warm in the winter. But you never had a cooker of your own, did you, Dad? You and Mum, when you got married, or an oven? No, he said. We couldn't afford things like that. Then how did you roast your pheasants? Ah, he said, that was quite a trick. We used to build a fire outside the caravan and roast them on a spit, the way the gypsies do. What's a spit? I asked. It's a long metal spike. You stick it through the pheasant and put it over the fire and keep turning it round. What you do is push 2 forked sticks into the ground, one on each side of the fire, and you rest the spit on the forks. Did it roast them well? Fairly well, he said, but an oven would do it better. Listen, Danny, Mr. Wheeler has all sorts of marvellous ovens in his shop now. He's got one in there with too many dials and knobs on it. It looks like the cockpit of an aircraft. Is that the one you want to buy, Dad? I don't know, he said. We'll decide tomorrow. We kept walking, and soon we saw the filling station glimmering in the moonlight ahead of us. Will Mr. Rabbit be waiting for us, do you think, Dad? I asked. Well, if he is, you won't see him, Danny. They'll always hide and watch you from behind a hedge or a tree. They won't come out if you're carrying a sack. I'm sorry, they'll only come out if you're carrying a sack over your shoulder, or if your pocket is bulging with something suspicious. We are carrying nothing at all, so don't worry about it. Whether or not Mr. Rabbit was watching us as we entered the filling station and headed for the caravan, I don't know. We saw no sign of him. Inside the caravan, my father lit the paraffin lamp, and I lit the burner and put the kettle on to make us a nice cup of cocoa. That, my father said, as we sat sipping hot cocoa a few minutes later, was the greatest time I've ever had in my whole life. And that is the end of chapter 18.